The Japanese began their southward push before the Philippine campaign had finished. They landed first on Rabaul in New Britain and caving in New Ireland just 3 weeks after Manila fell. From Rabaul, they launched 2 attacks, one into New Guinea from the southwest and the other across the Solomons from the southeast. Their goal was either to conquer or isolate Australia. New Guinea, stretching over 1,500 miles along a northwest-southeast line and covering more than 300,000 square miles, is one of the largest, least developed, and least known islands in the world. It prevents a direct northward approach to Australia. Its dense jungles and rocky mountains make its interior nearly impassable, which hindered the Japanese from advancing all the way to the coast. In early March 1942, the enemy set up camps at Lilay and Salamaua in the Gulf of Papua after landing on New Guinea. These served as staging points for further attacks along the Papuan coast. The progress of the Japanese was so convincing that Australia seriously considered surrendering much of Queensland, its northern province, and falling back to a defensive line just north of Brisbane. However, the march toward Australia was temporarily halted by a naval battle that coincided with the fall of Cretor on May 6th. This was the first battle in history decided entirely by carrier planes. Known as the Battle of the Coral Sea, it took place southeast of New Guinea between May 4th and May 8th. The enemy was pushed back, losing a carrier and sustaining damage to other ships. But the U.S. lost the carrier Lexington, and the Yorktown was also damaged. Although this was a significant blow to the Japanese, it didn't stop them. It only slowed their advance. The Japanese resumed their push, advancing along the Kota Trail through the Owen Stanley Mountains toward Port Moresby, the last Allied outpost in northern Australia. After landing troops at Gona, Buna, and Sananda on the northern Papuan coast on July 21st and 22nd, they came within 32 miles of Port Moresby before being halted. Meanwhile, the Japanese landed forces near Mill Bay, at the southeast tip of New Guinea, possibly in preparation for an amphibious assault on Port Moresby. After 3 days of fighting, Japanese destroyers evacuated 2 Australian brigades that had successfully attacked these forces. The warships returned to Mill Bay in early September to shell the Australians. On September 11th, Captain Cornelius W. Flynn's destroyer squadron sailed north to intercept the Japanese surface troops. But they were not found. There was no further attempt by the Japanese to send ships to Mill Bay. The intense battle for Guadalcanal, in which the enemy committed most of its naval, air, and ground forces, certainly contributed to the Japanese's eventual lack of resolve. With the arrival of U.S. ground forces in the Southwest Pacific and the majority of the Japanese forces focused on the Guadalcanal operation, American and Australian troops were able to concentrate on pushing the enemy out of eastern New Guinea. They forced the Japanese back across the Kakakota Road and made a flanking advance into Buna on the northern Papuan coast. On January 2nd, after a prolonged and grueling battle, Allied troops captured the Buna mission, where the terrain, rains, swamps, and jungles proved just as dangerous as the Japanese. By January 23rd, they had eliminated the last of the enemy forces at Sananda. Supporting the coastal advance into Buna, PT boats were the first naval vessels to engage in combat in the waters of New Guinea. In July 1942, the captain and crew of the tender Hilo witnessed the first PT boats, including PTS 21, 23, 25, and 26, which formed MTB Division II of Squadron 1 under the command of Lieutenant Jonathan F. Rice. The Hilo left Pearl Harbor 10 days later, heading 1,100 miles southwest to Palmyra Island, towing 2 boats while the others operated independently, refueling every morning. At Palmyra, the boats participated in the island's weekly battle exercises, and Lieutenant Calder, the commanding officer of the Hilo, later received a message from Admiral Nimitz, who, on his way to Guadalcanal, suggested the boats would be more useful farther south. After some brief maintenance at Pearl Harbor, the Hilo returned to Palmyra to retrieve the boats. On October 25th, the group departed Palmyra and, by November 2nd, had reached their new base in the Ellis Islands. As they departed, they kept an eye out for an aircraft piloted by Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who had been on a special War Department assignment and had reported being lost on October 21st, running low on fuel. On November 11th, Lieutenant Junior Grade Frederick E. Woodward, flying a Navy Kingfisher scout plane from Fafudi, spotted a yellow raft a few miles south of the atoll. This was the last sighting of the plane. Lieutenant Cluster from the Hilo, operating PT-21, recovered a very ill man who identified himself as Captain William T. Cherry, Jr., the pilot of the Rickenbacker plane. The other survivors had split into two rafts and were southwest of the location where PT-21 found Cherry. On November 12th, Lieutenant Commander Monroe led the Hilo and 4 PT boats at first light. A Kingfisher plane had spotted another raft northwest of the island, and despite the darkness, the boats rushed to the location. PT-26, under the command of Lieutenant J.M. Weeks, located the raft just before nightfall. Though Lieutenant William F. Eddy, the Kingfisher pilot, knew he couldn't carry any more passengers, he decided to pick up 3 survivors to avoid them missing rescue in the dark. He landed his plane and brought the 3 men on board, including Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, his assistant C. Adamson, and flight engineer John F. Bartech. Eddie's radio operator, L., was placed in the back seat of the Kingfisher, alongside Colonel Adamson, who was suffering from severe back pain. After adjusting Rickenbacker to the starboard wing and Bartech to the port wing, Eddie began taxiing back to Fafudi, which was 40 meters away. The PT-26 arrived in just a few minutes. Though Bartech and Rickenbacker were moved to the PT boat, it was decided the aircraft would continue taxiing to the base instead of risking the relocation of the injured Adamson. Lieutenant Edward M. Garden, the executive officer of the Hilo, mentioned an interesting detail about Captain Rickenbacker's condition. When taken aboard, Rickenbacker remarked that he had never seen a PT boat before, and expressed interest in inspecting it despite having been on a raft for 21 days. The captain of the PT boat gave him a full tour, showing him the ship's features. Lieutenant Colonel Franklin Good, USMC, came aboard the Hilo the next morning after it anchored at Funafuti. He informed Lieutenant Commander Monroe that a 3rd raft with 3 survivors had washed ashore at Nuku Feto, 60 miles to the northwest, as reported by a coast watcher. Monroe immediately got underway and reached the island by the afternoon. The lagoon appeared too muddy for a safe landing, so he sent the whaleboat with Matt Garden and Dr. Gitty. They returned about an hour later with 3 survivors: Staff Sergeant J.W. Reynolds, Lieutenant J.H. DeAngelis, and co-pilot Lieutenant J.C. Whitaker. While Whitaker was in relatively good shape, the other 2 were in poor condition, extremely thin, and covered in ulcers. Monroe was surprised to see that the oldest men in the group, Rickenbacker and Whitaker, were in the best condition. Garden and Gitty returned with a peculiar story. They spoke of a charming native girl who conversed with them in perfect English, invited them to stay the night, and even offered them a drink. Neither officer could offer further details. Whitaker and DeAngelis were transferred to the hospital, while Reynolds, in worse shape, remained aboard for a few days, receiving glucose and plasma from Dr. Gitty. After staying overnight, Monroe returned to Fafudi the next morning. The Marines and CBS were cooperative, providing as much as they could with their limited resources. Monroe offloaded spare engines, torpedoes, and all Packard and Elco parts. On November 24th, he received a dispatch from KOPAC instructing him to proceed to Noumea, leaving the 4 boats behind at Fafudi. This put the boats in a tough situation, as they lacked a pier, bulk gasoline, torpedo compressors, dry docks, and proper facilities. Water had to be delivered in gas drums. Hilo departed Fafudi the next day and arrived in Noumea on December 2nd. Division 17, which consisted of PTS 113 and 114 from Squadron 2 and PTS 119 to 122 from Squadron 6, was commanded by Lieutenant Daniel S. Baumann II, who had previously been the executive officer of Squadron 6. Lieutenant Commander Monroe was ordered to transport the Hilo and the 4 boats of Division 17 to Cairns, Australia, and report to the commander of Southwest Pacific Forces. Monroe learned that PTS 121 and 122 had already left for Cairns a few days earlier, towed by a Liberty ship that was also carrying part of the division's spares. Hilo refueled and followed another Liberty ship to load the remaining spares. Due to a barge capsizing the day before, many essential Packard spares were lost. After a hectic loading process, which also involved a small base force boarding the ship, Hilo and the 4 boats departed Noumea late on the afternoon of December 3rd. Tow lines were passed to 2 of the boats, and they proceeded at a slow pace of 5 knots, escorted by the USS Aaron Ward. The weather was poor, with frequent squalls and low visibility, and the personnel aboard the boats, most of whom had never been to sea, struggled to maintain position. During one particularly rough night, one of the boats kept falling out of sight. The boat quartermaster, inexperienced and unable to read blinker signals, took 3 hours to respond to a visual message and another hour to reach the Hilo. Once alongside, Monroe firmly told the boat captain to stay within 200 yards of the Hilo. Upon arrival at Cairns, the boats held a meeting about the next leg of the journey. One boat captain, who shall remain unnamed, complained about Monroe's tone when communicating via megaphone. Monroe was exhausted after 7 days at sea, with only 21 hours of sleep. Tow lines were often parting, and boat engines were failing. The escorting destroyer skipper sent several comforting messages. On the morning of December 11th, the Hilo and the PT boats arrived in Cairns. The following day, they were instructed to head straight for Milne Bay and report to Commander Task Group 50.1, which was designated as the PT Task Group in New Guinea. 3 days earlier, PTS 121 and 122 had left Milne Bay with the gunboat Tulsa. The advanced echelon of PT Base 4 was also in Cairns. Monroe noted that confusion reigned in Cairns. They encountered the HMAS Arena, a destroyer whose captain, Calder J.D. Morrow, was known for his formidable wine mess. The base site was located in a mangrove swamp with no construction equipment. The squadron's equipment that had been offloaded earlier was found rifled through in a municipal warehouse. They took as much gear as possible, including an advanced communications unit with Ensign Simons in charge, along with a bottle of Australian beer and a Red Cross package for each man. The evening aboard the HMAS Arena was a nerve-wracking experience. Late on the 15th, Hilo departed Cairns, picking up its escort, the USS Patterson, under the command of a classmate, Lieutenant Commander Schultz of the U.S. Navy. All boats operated independently, refueling along the way due to the short distance and potential for enemy air assaults. The weather remained poor, and Schultz made several disparaging remarks about it. On the morning of the 17th, they picked up the New Guinea coast and fixed their position. Schultz then turned around and said, "Goodbye now. This was as far as we were allowed to go, and it made us feel awful." That was the last time we saw a U.S. naval vessel, other than the Tulsa and the occasional SC or YP, until Riel arrived in late May. Although Milne Bay offered Hilo several suitable anchorages, it was too far behind the front lines to function as a PT operating base. Ora, just 15 miles from Buna, was controlled by ground soldiers who had advanced 200 kilometers up the coast. A base further up the coast was needed for the boats. After arriving in Milne Bay 2 days earlier, PTs 121 and 122 were sent to Porlick Harbor, located on the western side of the Cape Nelson Peninsula, on December 13th to establish an advanced base. On the night of December 18th and 19th, the 121st and 122nd carried out their first patrol in New Guinea waters. They launched 2 torpedoes after spotting a surfaced submarine. Although they were certain the torpedoes did not detonate, the boat captains believed they had hit the target. It was quickly found that Porlick Harbor was unsuitable. The water was so shallow that even a small supply ship couldn't unload petroleum drums. The land was muddy, with no places for the boats to disperse. The only way to get gasoline ashore was by dumping the drums overboard and having boat personnel swim them to the beach. On December 18th, Commander Edgar T. Neal, leading Task Group 50.1, left Milne Bay in search of a better base in the Cape Nelson region. The next day, he discovered Tufi on the eastern side of the Cape. The inlet was deep, narrow, and winding, with steep hills rising on both sides. A small flat area of ground at the foot of a steep hill could be used for a gasoline dump, and there was a small dock near the entrance. Boats could tie up further up the inlet, safe from enemy aircraft detection. A small stream of cold, clear water flowed into the inlet, and a representative from the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit, who operated out of Tufi, helped recruit local workers for heavy tasks, such as rolling petroleum drums. The boats immediately moved to Tufi after leaving Porlick Harbor. Tulsa brought the mobile communications unit and base equipment to the new location in just a few days. On the evening of December 23rd and 24th, the patrol reported sighting what appeared to be an enemy submarine. Lieutenant Bowman patrolled the coast, and PT-22's Robert F. Lynch spotted a large submarine, completely surfaced, about 15 miles past Buna, off the mouth of the Kumi River. He believed another submarine was nearby. Lynch aimed the torpedo director, fired 2 torpedoes at a range of 1,000 yards, and Theodore F. Bruno, USNR, guided the boat. The submarine didn't sink after the brief flare and water eruption, but Bruno continued another 500 yards, and Lynch fired his forward torpedoes. A second explosion followed when the starboard torpedo detonated. The submarine split in 2 and sank, with huge sheets of flame rising. PT-22 was officially credited with sinking the 2,180-ton submarine E-22, but recent research has cast doubt on this claim, and the identity of the target and the full extent of the damage remain uncertain. The 122 had to dodge 4 torpedoes 10 minutes after the submarine exploded, as another submarine attempted to retaliate. That same night, PTs 114 and 121 sank 2 landing craft carrying troops at Douglas Harbor. The Japanese fired small arms at the boats, but there were no injuries or damage. According to Commander Neal, the tactics used by both sides were chaotic. By early January, it became clear that the fall of Buna was imminent. A Japanese force, including 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 4 merchant ships, was reported to be heading from Gasmata on the south coast of New Britain on January 6th. However, the threat never materialized, and PTs were ready for action. It was later discovered that the enemy convoy had entered Lae after our aircraft caused only minor damage to it. On the evening of January 17th and 18th, PT-120 encountered 3 barges carrying Japanese Army officials near Douglas Harbor. Under heavy machine gun and 20mm fire, PT-120 sank 2 of the barges and set the 3rd on fire. The fire resulted in the death of John J. Masters, Jr., who posthumously received the Silver Star with the following citation. Although mortally wounded at the start of the action, he held his position until he was too weak from blood loss to continue. Even then, despite excruciating pain, and the risk of falling overboard, he did not request assistance until the engagement was over, dedicating his final moments to instructing an inexperienced replacement. His unwavering devotion and courage under fire played a significant role in the sinking of 2 landing craft and the immobilization of a 3rd. However, this was 1943 in New Guinea, not 1942 in the Philippines, and more PTs were on their way.